Welcome to Biz Help for You with host Candy Messer. Entrepreneurs like to focus on the big picture, like profitability, success, and a smooth-running organization. But there always seems to be those little things like taxes, employee compensation, laws, regulations, and more. Now you can get the answers you need in one place. Join us today as we break it all down for you. Now, here's your host, Candy Messer.
Hello and welcome to Biz Help for You with Candy Messer. Thank you for joining us today. I hope you found the information on last week's show, ACT, Align, Communicate, Teamwork, informative. If you're unable to listen and would like to find our links, feel free to visit our Facebook or YouTube pages for the episode, as well as finding it on multiple favorite podcast platforms. If you'd like to receive notifications on when our episodes have been posted, please like and subscribe. If there are topics you'd find beneficial or questions you have, please feel free to reach out to me at media@abandp.com. Now let's learn a little bit about our guest today. Michael wrote the book on understanding consumers. Literally, hundreds of thousands of business students have learned about marketing from his books, including Consumer Behavior, Buying, Having, and Being, the most widely used book on the subject in the world. Much in demand as a keynote speaker, Michael often is asked to provide briefings to global executive teams who want significant increases in their bottom line and who understand that's accomplished by a deeper connection with their customers. Michael's mantra: we don't buy products because of what they do, we buy them because of what they mean. He advises global clients in leading industries such as apparel and footwear, Calvin Klein, Levi Strauss, Under Armour, and Timberland, financial services and e-commerce such as eBay and Progressive, consumer product goods, Procter & Gamble, Campbell's, retailing, H&M, and sports, Philadelphia Eagles, manufacturing, DuPont, PP&G, and transportation, BMW, United Airlines, on their marketing strategies to help them be more consumer-centric. He regularly appears on television shows, including The Today Show, Good Morning America, and CNN, to comment on consumer issues, and he's frequently quoted in major media outlets such as the New York Times, USA Today, Adweek, and Time. Michael's a contributor at Forbes.com, where he writes about issues related to consumer behavior, marketing, and retailing. Michael's latest book is The New Chameleons: How to Connect with Consumers Who Defy Categorization, Kogan Page 2021. As a professor of marketing in the Hope School of Business at St. John's University in Philadelphia and an industry consultant, Michael combines cutting-edge academic theory with actionable real-world strategies. His articles published in journals, including the Journal of Consumer Research, Journal of Marketing, Journal of Advertising, Journal of Retailing, and Journal of Business Research, have been cited over 30,000 times. He helps managers get inside the heads of their customers so they can anticipate and satisfy their deepest and most pressing needs today and tomorrow. An executive at Subaru said it best: the man is a scholar who is current and streetwise. So, Michael, welcome to the show.
Candy, thanks so much for having me on. I appreciate it.
Well, that was a lot of information that I shared about your bio, but I know there's a lot more to it. So I always ask my guests to share a little bit more about who they are and how they got into doing what they're doing. So why don't you give us a little more background?
Well, sure. As you noted in the introduction, I'm a marketing professor, actually at St. Joseph's University, not St. John's. Those get mixed up a lot. In Philadelphia. And I've been a marketing professor for about, I hate to say it, about 40 years. And during that time, I've had the opportunity to work with a lot of companies to help them to understand what makes their customers tick. And this is a relatively small specialized field. It's called consumer psychology. And that's where I'm located in terms of my research and my consulting and so on, and essentially, really what we try to do is to figure out, as you might guess, why people buy what they do, and most importantly, what those products and services really mean to them. And as you indicated in your nice introduction, really, I think a lot of businesses miss the boat because they're focusing way too much on what they sell rather than on what customers buy. And those two things can be quite different. So really, a lot of my work, when you boil it down, is getting a marketer to understand that they may sell, for example, a 3/4 inch drill bit, but their customer is buying a 3/4 inch hole, and that's a very different proposition. So even at that kind of simple point of departure, there's a lot of really fascinating things that go on when we look at how everyday people interact with the brands around them. And that's kind of what I do, and helping my students to see that is very gratifying, and definitely helping businesses to see that and improve what they do, and hopefully improve quality of life, because people are more likely to get what they want. And that's really what marketing is all about at the end of the day, I think.
That's so true. Well, in your bio, I read the comment that said, we don't buy things because of what they do, we buy them because of what they mean. So can you elaborate on that a little bit more? I know you just kind of talked a little bit about the drill bit and the hole, but I think there's a little bit more of a definition you could give there.
Yeah, well, obviously, a product or a service has to function as promised. And the reality is that we love to complain about things we buy, but really most things today, at the risk of generalizing, pretty much do what they say they're going to do. There are obviously exceptions to that, but pretty much they do. And a lot of times when you ask customers, if you give them, say, a list of 3 or 4 or 5 brands in a category, and you ask them to pick the one that's much better than the others, they might give an answer that's pretty frustrating to the marketers, and that is, well, they're all pretty much the same. They all pretty much do what they say they're going to do. But having said that, there's often 1 or 2 brands in a category that are way above the others. And the reason for their success, and I'm thinking of the usual candidates, like the Nikes and the Apples and the Lululemons of the world, that really stand out. And obviously they make good stuff, but people aren't buying just good stuff. They're buying a story. They're buying the story of that brand. And that story it includes the functionality of the product, to be sure, but it goes way, way beyond that. And that's why it's so important to keep in mind that functionality and meaning are 2 different things. And really, no matter whether you're running, whether you're marketing for Nike or whether it's a mom and pop store, you have a story to tell. And that is the way you differentiate yourself.
That's so important to think through. So thank you for sharing that definition too, because I really just want to make sure that listeners are really understanding the concept of, what we're going to be discussing. And it's not necessarily just the product that you're selling, but the result that they're getting. So thank you so much.
Yeah.
But in terms of
those results, and I'm sure.
Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I'm sure we'll talk more about this, but really what your listeners may have heard the term that we live in an eyeball economy or an attention economy. And if you're familiar with that kind of thinking, that's really what I'm saying, which is that, obviously at the end of the day, we have to make money or whatever currency we're being measured in. But really getting the customer's attention is, and hopefully getting them to engage with what you're selling. That's the secret sauce today.
So what is the single biggest obstacle that marketers face then in terms of connecting with their customers?
Well, I think it is that, that engagement issue. And, it's interesting when what I believe is that despite all, marketing is it changes every day. It's an amazing time to be in marketing, and both in a good way and a bad way, because the sand shifts so much. But at the end of the day, I mentioned that term, attention economy. The biggest challenge is that simple, is getting your customers' attention. And we're all guilty of this. We're all submerged in our phones and, the different pop-ups and the different distractions and multitasking and of course, competing messages from other companies. And the average person, the average adult consumer today in the Western world is exposed to somewhere between, let's say, 4,000 to 5,000 messages a day.
Wow.
And as you might imagine, the very, very large majority of those they kind of go right by us. We don't actively think about them. We just couldn't. We're not wired to do that. And so that you might say is the biggest challenge. We could talk about the race to get customers, but it's one of the hardest things is just to get entered into that race and for customers to become aware that you're offering something that they may actually want.
Mm-hmm. So are there strategies that you recommend then that a business would use to engage those customers? Because, I've heard so many different things that we can do, but, are they going to work? Are they not going to work? So in your experience, what would you recommend?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's, if you've got a few hours, I can try to answer that question. I'm actually, for what it's worth, getting ready within a week or two to launch an online course on that very topic that's called Engage, how to connect with your customers. And there's no one simple answer, but there are some relatively simple solutions. And one is just to be at that very basic level of getting attention is, as you could, anybody listening could think of this: novelty, being different from what is immediately around you, just in terms of getting noticed. If everybody's if all the women are wearing black, but one woman walks into a party wearing red, we all see her, but vice versa as well. If they were all wearing red, one with black, we would notice her. So there are some simple, they're very simple principles of contrast and novelty at that very basic level. Now, as you move the customer down that funnel, if hopefully they get more and more interested in learning about what you have to offer, then there are some things that we can talk about in terms of building desire. And a lot of those essentially have to do with linking what you're selling to other things in the person's life that they find important, projects that they're working on, ways that they're working on themselves. So if part of my project is to is to lose 20 pounds, then suddenly I'm going to be a lot more interested in weight loss products, just to take a simple example. And so tying your product to that weight loss goal, if that happens to be appropriate, it sounds like common sense, but again, it's not just about how many pounds you'll lose, it's what you'll feel like when you get there. And that's what people are buying. So really, again, at the initial levels of awareness, there are certain things that you can do to maximize the chance of getting noticed. That just gets you into the race. That buys you an entrance into the race. The race itself is won by the products that create this desire. We call these cult products, and everybody has a few that they're probably wild about. And again, some of the obvious ones, like I said, Apple and Nike and all that. But there's lots of things. If somebody is, let's say, a hobbyist of some kind, or they're into professional services or something, there's probably some brands out there that have a lot of meaning to them. You don't have to be Nike or Apple and have a multi-billion-dollar marketing budget to make yourself indispensable to your customers.
Right. Well, when you were talking about novelty, one thing that I was wondering though too is, what if someone says, well, how do I make my product seem new or different if it's been around for a really long time, or it's very similar to other things in the market, and I'm not sure really how to make that seem novel? Like, what would you recommend?
Yeah. Well, ironically, you gave a solution in your question. One of the most important things that people are looking for today, especially younger people, but pretty much across the board, is that elusive quality that we call authenticity. People want to buy things that they know. They're not interested in hype, and especially after the pandemic, but even before that, this was happening. People want to know what they're buying. They want to know who they're buying it from. And so if you've been around a really long time, that is a competitive advantage that
Mm.
other people don't necessarily have. And as I tell audiences when I speak about these things, if your brand has a story to tell it. If
Mm.
if you have been around, we've been around for 50 years, there's nothing new for us. Well, just the fact that you've been around for 50 years, I'd say is worth, telling people about. And maybe if you think about, for example, so-called founder stories, the
Mm.
story of how the brand got started, those Nike shoes that the founder of Nike made in a waffle iron initially and, sold out of the trunk of his car. Well, that's the kind of story people want to hear about. So if it's
Mm.
a small business, and let's say it's, I don't know, two sisters who found that they couldn't find any soap that was gentle enough for their babies, and so they invented a new soap, and now this is what they're selling. I made that up, but something like that is that is a distinctive selling point. And so I'm definitely not saying be something that you're not. What I'm saying is be more of what you are.
Right. That's so wise. Well, thank you for sharing that too. So in your book, you state that the familiar mass market segmentation strategies many companies have traditionally used for a long time are no longer as relevant in a postmodern consumer culture. So what does that mean?
Yeah, well, that'll take a few hours too, but I'll try to boil it down. Now, basically, what that means is that if you think back to the early days of modern marketing, the Mad Men days of the 50s and 60s, this was a time, and before that, this was a time when our culture was, compared to where we are today, very homogeneous. We had, and if you think about the way that media were structured, we had, some of us can remember anyway, having 3 or 4 television networks. And that was basically what you did. You picked one of those networks and you watched Ed Sullivan on Sunday night, and everybody was there at that time. Now, fast forward to today, obviously there's very few events, maybe the Super Bowl, maybe the World Cup, something like that is going to get a significant number of eyeballs there. But when you look at your cable offerings and you've got, several thousand stations, and most of them, who knows what's on there, but
Right.
but that's a good metaphor for the kind of the splintering of our culture. It's much more fragmented than it used to be. And what that means is that and also obviously because of the internet and all that, one of the biggest, I think the biggest development in marketing in the last 20 or 30 years is the ability for consumers to talk back to companies and to find one another. And so what you see is that you have these smaller groups, not these large homogeneous market segments that we teach our students to identify, but rather these small groups of really passionate people who are uniting around a craft beer or yoga or whatever it happens to be. And so everybody wants to be unique today. When I say to my students, well, you're all in your early 20s, you're all attending a private school in Philadelphia, blah blah blah. That means you're all the same in marketers' eyes. You're all the same, right? You all have the same tastes and preferences, and they look at me like I'm from Mars because, of course, they don't feel that way. And I think that's true for most of us. We don't want to be put into these categories, given a label, and then people think they understand us because they've given us this label. And so today it makes more sense in many cases to talk about markets of one, where each of us is literally our own market. And this is happening all the time, and anytime you get a personalized message, on your phone, a pop-up ad. How did they know I was looking at barbecue grills? Here's barbecue, right? I mean, that's all part of this markets of one approach. Now, there are some ethical issues that are troubling in terms of privacy. That's a separate discussion, right? But the reality is that the best predictor of what you'll buy tomorrow is what you bought yesterday. And so why should I worry about whether you're male or female, young or old in this? Because a lot of those basic categories that we use to describe people are going away. And this is really what the book, The New Chameleons, is about, where And I systematically go through some very basic categories that we use all the time and show why they don't make sense anymore. So for example, we all assume there's a basic dichotomy when we think about our customers. They're either male or female. You got to be one or the other. Well, you got to be living under a rock, if you don't realize that today around the world, this conversation is being revisited. What does it mean to be male or female? Can I be a little bit of each? Can I be neither? Everybody's specifying the pronouns that they want to use in their emails and things like that. So that's an example of a very, very fundamental categorization or segmentation scheme, because after all, a lot of companies either sell, they sell to men or they sell to women. Well, right. This in this example, for example, if you sell to men, men are starting to adopt products that women have used, like man bags and accessories and things like that. If you don't view that as a quote male product, then you sell accessories, you're missing the boat, because half of the population is you're not talking to them. And there's many basic categories like that, rich versus poor, black versus white, producer versus consumer. That's a very, very important one. Many of your customers today are also becoming producers. They're becoming manufacturers. They're becoming hotel keepers. They're becoming taxi drivers if they go on Uber. They're distributors. Maybe they're selling Mary Kay or Amway in a direct selling model. But in many cases, when we talk about this sharing economy, and we've all heard that term, what that means is that people who just used to be only the passive consumers of what they buy are now being much more proactive. And so many of these categories that we just never question them because they're so basic really have to be revisited. And when you do that, that's why I call these new consumers the new chameleons. The title of the book is The New Chameleons. And the metaphor is that just like chameleons change their colors frequently in response to environmental changes, we change our identities very, very frequently. And so in the course of a day, you could be a homeowner, you could be a business owner, you could be a partner, you could be a parent, you could be a child, you could be an athlete, on and on and on. And for each of these identities, we need products and services to do those well. And that's where a lot of that engagement that we were talking about before comes in. If I can link my product to identities that your customers find valuable, then I'm going well beyond just a functional thing that's sitting on a shelf. I'm becoming part of that customer's life. And that's how you increase engagement.
Right. Well, and when you were talking about, in the olden days, you had these categories that you were looking at, and, that's changing now, but we still hear, you need to identify your target market or create an avatar and, know all of these things about, your ideal customer. So what are some of those things maybe that they should focus a little bit more on than, what they've maybe been told to do in the past? Because that's still a little confusing, I think.
Yeah, that's a great question. And let me emphasize, I'm not saying that we should throw the baby out with the bathwater. I mean, there is some segmentation that makes sense, but don't get hemmed in by the structures that you create. So you mentioned creating a persona. That's a great idea. The persona, sometimes called the avatar, that's your ideal customer. It's very, very useful to know that. But remember, well, first of all, remember what I just said. Each of us is actually many selves. Each of us has many identities. And so if you create your persona, but you just locate him or her in one place and in one occasion and one identity, you're missing out on the totality of their life. And there might be other opportunities for you there. And so it's great. I'm not saying that you shouldn't do that. You want to understand, especially your heavy customer, in the sense of, your very active customer. If they fit a profile, you definitely want to do that. But that is not the way that traditional market segmentation works. In the traditional approach, first of all, it's, a lot of people think, well, I just have to describe them demographically, in terms of age and gender and where they live and income, and then I'm done. You definitely need to go beyond that into what we call psychographics to add much more nuance and complexity to that. So definitely, it's a valuable first step to say, well, is my typical customer 20 or 70? That's right. Probably no, but that doesn't mean, if the answer is 20, when you look today at age categories, there's another one. We say 60 is the new 40, and we have, we have little kids, we have little tween kids that dress up as if they're 30 years old, and there's a lot of movement back and forth, and so if you refuse to sell to someone over the age of 25, you're probably missing out on quite a bit. So the moral of the story is, sure, use these methods. Provide as much detail as you can about your heavy users, but don't forget that just like your heavy user grows and changes. You're not the same person you were 3 years ago. None of us are the same people, come to think of it, that we were 3 years ago after the pandemic, but we all change, we all change over time. And so the danger of using these techniques is when you assume that you've checked the box and now you don't have to update that anymore.
Right. So what about the difference between like online and offline, selling, or how customers are buying? Do they, obviously we know a lot more people are buying things online too, but there's still a lot of things you have to go to in person. So like, what about that? Is that changing too?
Yes, that's one of the basic dichotomies that I devoted a chapter to in the book, online versus offline. And, back in the day, we made a choice. Should I be selling online or should I be selling offline? Today, the answer is yes, you should be selling both online and offline, because the reality is what you need to be today is what's called omni-channel, or sometimes platform agnostic. And that means that you don't create, it's kind of like a hammer in search of a nail. Somebody might say, well, I'm going to sell only online, and therefore they focus only on that. But the reality is that their customers are probably going online, offline all day long. I know my students do. While I'm lecturing to them in class, they're all checking their Facebook pages, right? They think I don't know, but I do. And so all of us increasingly, again, if you think about it, back in if some of your viewers can remember when we used to go online, and that was a process that involved making a phone connection, and you'd hear that sound of the phone connecting. And so, it was a project to go online. Obviously today, that's not the case. And so it's no longer the case that we're either offline or online. Most of us are online and offline 24/7. So to the extent that you can, you want to understand your customers' media habits. For example, you may have, I'm making this up, but your ideal customer may spend a lot of time in public places like bars and restaurants, where they get a lot of their information from the closed circuit TV that's hanging up on top of the bar or something. Well, that's where you should be. It's not a question of whether you want to be online or offline. It's a question of where your customers are. Yeah.
Well, how does someone even know? Like, say someone's maybe starting out a business, or maybe they've been in business for a few years and now they're really thinking more about, I need to do better marketing. How would they even know necessarily where they should be to be found by these customers? Because like you're saying, you need to be where they're going to get the information, not necessarily where you think you should be.
Right. Well, ideally, you can, even if you're just starting out, maybe you've been encouraged by a few people who just love what you're doing, and they're the ones that say to you, you should go into business. You're really good at this. Well, learn a little bit more about them. How do they find out about new products and services? Simple question. So the most basic thing you can do is just ask someone. Now, there are reasons why you may not get 100% valid answer there, but it's a lot better than you were at before.
Right.
So one thing to do is just to start with your customers, even if you only have a few hardcore ones, or maybe it's just your cousins that love you, but at least that's a start. That's a toehold, and they may help you to flesh out that persona that we were talking about. Part of that persona profile should include media usage. So again, you want to tailor to the segment. For example, if I'm trying to reach college students, the last thing I'm going to do is spend money on newspaper advertising, because they don't read newspapers at all. Maybe the campus newspaper on now and then. So why would I do that, right? But if I know that that's who my target is, I can find out what their media habits are, and then I can work backwards. And that's true for every group.
Very helpful. So in your book, you also talk about merging of flesh versus machine. So what is that about?
That's one of my favorites. It's in the old days, as I say in the book, in the old days, we used to put things on our body to modify our identities. Today, we put things in our bodies. And so this boundary between flesh and machine really doesn't exist so much anymore. And anybody who has a pacemaker or a artificial hip or implant of any kind, anybody who wears contact lenses that can monitor glucose levels if you're a diabetic, or even to some extent wearables, like Apple Watches and Fitbits and things like that. What all that is doing is eroding that boundary between the self as a flesh and blood person and the self as really like a cyborg or an android. And then on the other hand, we have, robots and androids that increasingly are going to be used in sales situations or as caregivers. That's something I'm doing some research on now. And so it's already, for example, some older people, in assisted living situations have a robot that takes care of them. That's obviously something we used to rely upon relatives or somebody we'd hired to do. And so again, that boundary between what is organic and living and what is, again, in popular culture TV shows, what are the rights of androids? Are we exploiting our robots, or, Westworld and robots going crazy? That's a very dominant theme in our culture right now. And with good reason, because we know that there are some professions that are probably going to be wiped out by artificial intelligence and robots, like, say, long distance truck drivers, when we get self-driving trucks, and again, that has both good and bad consequences. Not good for the truck drivers, but it means that our society is moving very quickly toward having a lot of functions that where now flesh and blood people are doing those things, to having machines doing that. And that includes professional services, like accounting and to some extent marketing, things that can get decisions that can get automated in marketing. That's already happening. So we're all part robot already, I think.
Right. I think sometimes, though, you still have to make sure that your consumer really wants to have that, obviously, right? Like, I mean, it can make things more efficient for you. But one of the things I dislike myself is, if you go to like a website, or maybe you're on someone's page and one of those little chat bots, pops up or something, and it says, enter your question, and you enter the question and the answer has no real answer to the question you actually have. It's like they don't actually have everything you needed. It would be much faster for me to have actually just had a very quick chat with a live person and say, here's my question. They could give me the answer, but the chatbot makes you go through all these, questions, and then you don't get your answer.
Right. Well, I think we've all been there, haven't we? But having said that, there have been times when I've interacted with a human where I'd much rather be talking to the chatbot, because the human isn't very competent either.
Yeah.
And I think, what you're pointing out is really just temporary, because as the thing about artificial intelligence and machine learning is that, and what's a little scary is that these machines learn as they go, and they improve as they
get
go.
Better.
And, all what you're describing here is just a deficiency on the part of the people who programmed this particular chatbot not to give you the right answer. My guess is if you went back to that same one 10 years later, it would be unbelievable how much
right.
better
It'll
they
be
are.
different.
Whereas,
for sure.
whereas that incompetent person probably isn't any better 10 years later.
Understood. Yep. So earlier, I think you were talking a little bit about the younger shopper, but you talk about them as having a hive mind, and you show that that's changing this sequence of steps, of how consumers are purchasing things. So can you just talk a little bit more about that hive and what you mean by that?
Yeah, well, the hive mind is what that shows people is that I'm a Star Trek fan, because if anybody watches Star Trek, they know about the hive mind, the Borg that assimilate other races into their, whatever it is. But if you've never watched Star Trek, that's okay too. What I mean is that we've gone from what I say is the era of me to the era of we. Where so many of the decisions we make today, we make them with other people, or we need to have them validated immediately by other people. We've all seen, especially younger people, sit at a restaurant and they can't eat their food until they've snapped a picture of it and posted it on Instagram. So they're documenting their lives even as they're living them. And what that means is, and with the technology that's available, actually, ironically, it's replacing in the old days, you might have, let's say, a group of men or women who 4 or 5 of them, they go out on a shopping trip and they spend the day at the mall and, they all try on clothes or blah, blah, blah. Well, today we're not doing that so much anymore, but the technology is rapidly evolving to where we can now do that online. So if you have 4 of your friends and you want to go virtual shopping, you can still get their feedback, because for example, they might be able to see you standing in a store. Let's say you're a bride and your maids of honor are all around the country, can't be together. You can FaceTime or something else with them while you're trying on your gown and get that feedback. So really, a lot of decisions, ironically, a lot of the decisions we used to make quite quickly, we're working much harder to make. And this is one of the big ironies, I think, of the internet. The internet was supposed to make our lives easier, and in some ways it does. But what we see is that people are using the internet to do research on options for just about anything. So you can't just go to a restaurant anymore. First, you have to read some reviews. You can't just buy a piece of electrical equipment or a sweater or whatever. You have to read how people have rated that. There's this tremendous amount of homework that's being done before the decision. We used to make the decision fairly quickly and then get feedback. And if our friends said, "What were you thinking?" maybe we would return that thing to the store. But today we're getting that feedback much earlier. And that's a fundamental change. And so for a lot of young people, and again, it's not just young people by any means, basically they're on 24/7. They're constantly getting updates about things that they're interested in, even if they weren't ready to buy at that moment. In the old days, again, when we were ready to buy something, that was usually the trigger to go out now and start doing the research on it. Today, a lot of people are just in a constant state of research and then once they decide to buy something, guess what? A lot of times they already know exactly what they're going to buy. They're just going into different stores to see if they can get it at a better price.
Interesting. One other thing I just thought of as you're talking about, the younger generation too, it seems like they are much more socially conscious too, and are often looking for products that if they buy something, another pair is given to, someone in need, or there's some other type of benefit that happens through their purchase. We haven't talked about that yet. What have you seen in terms of how to be marketing to kind of take that into consideration?
Yeah, I mean, that's been probably the biggest change since the pandemic. Although the pandemic I always want to emphasize this, the pandemic did not cause people to be more socially responsible or aware. All it did was to kind of throw fuel on the fire, because we were seeing this movement growing. The pandemic did definitely throw fuel on the fire. So let's go back to something I said earlier. I said that the holy grail in terms of what people are looking for in brands today is that word authenticity. Right. Now, authenticity actually covers a lot of ground. One of the meanings is what we were talking about, and that you've been around forever. But authenticity also means that you are genuinely involved with your stakeholders. You're concerned for their welfare, they're concerned for yours. And part of that is sustainability. Part of that is, how do you treat your workers? Are you paying them minimum wage, et cetera? All of that is wrapped under this big umbrella that we can call authenticity. And that is definitely something that people are looking for today. Now, whether that will persist, people are fickle and all. And, the problem is that quite honestly, sometimes people like to have, say, sustainable products, but if they think that they cost more, that's a different story. Now, there's no, it turns out that they don't necessarily have to cost more, but that is the perception people have. Well, I'm paying a premium to be green. Right. And so we'll see, as the saying goes, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. But certainly at this moment in time, for example, in the apparel industry where I do some work, that is all that anybody is talking about, is sustainability. And so, yeah, I mean, that's definitely a sea change that we saw coming. It was starting just before the recession in 08, 07. It was really starting to hit the mainstream. But then we hit the recession, prices, well, we all know what happened. And people said, well, right now I can't worry about being green. I've just got to worry about making my payroll this week. Right. So now maybe we're kind of in the second wave of that. And I agree with you that it's hugely important today. Right. It's equally important, if I may add, it's equally important to walk the walk and not just talk the talk. So the worst thing you can do is so-called greenwashing, which is unfortunately very common, where you make claims about your environmental friendliness that are not true. And the large majority of those claims, research has found, are not true. So I worry a little bit about companies poisoning the well by, telling customers, yeah, well, we're wonderful for the earth, and they're really not. Right. Once customers figure that out, as I like to say, they have this BS detector that is very, very sensitive. Yeah. Exactly. Well, this has been interesting, talking about the chameleons and change and, how that impacts our marketing and everything. But I know we're running out of time. So I do want to ask if you have an offer that you would like to share with our listener. Well, thank you. I mentioned earlier that I'm getting ready to launch an online course. I think it's pretty good on customer engagement. I'm not quite ready to do that, but if any listener wants to email me, I will get back to them literally it will be within a week or two with more details about that. Yeah, it's called Engage. How to turn your bored customers into brand fanatics. Nice. That sounds like a great topic. Very good for relatively smaller companies that don't have the luxury of having a huge marketing or insights department. So what is that email address? That's Michael, Michael, at michaelsolomon.com. 3 O's. Perfect. And is there any other way that they could reach out to you, find you on social media? Definitely on LinkedIn is a great place to find me. But I have my website is michaelsolomon.com. I've got free resources on there if anyone's interested. Nice. Well, thank you, Michael, for sharing your expertise and being a guest on my show. I really appreciate the time that you took to be here today. Oh, it was my pleasure, and it was great talking to you, and the best of luck to you and your followers.
Thank you. I do also want to thank those listeners for having tuned in today. I hope you found this topic interesting and it answered some questions on the new Chameleons, unlocking marketing's old cages to profit from disruption. If you have any additional questions or comments, be sure to reach out to Michael through that email or website that he shared, or you can send us a message at media@abandp.com. And would you please share our show information with those you know? I'd greatly appreciate your support. I hope you can join us for next week's topic, the difference between management and leadership and why it matters. And please remember, you can connect with us on Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn. And my website is abandp.com. Don't forget, you could also find the podcast posted on multiple favorite podcast stations, as well as Google, TuneIn, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, and Spotify. Until next time, have a great week.
Thank you for listening to Biz Help for You. Please join your host, Candy Messer, again next Tuesday. Have a terrific week.